The first thing I heard when I opened my eyes was my wife asking a doctor how quickly hospice papers could be approved. If there's no meaningful recovery, I could not move my left arm. My tongue felt heavy. Machines beeped beside me while Carol stood near the doorway speaking in a calm voice, almost bored, like she was handling paperwork for a stranger instead of talking about her husband. Then I heard her brother Ethan lower his voice. Once Daniel's officially out of the picture, the investors will stop hesitating. And right there in that hospital bed, unable to even sit up on my own, I realized my family had already started replacing me before I was gone. Let me take you back to how it all started. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 61 years old, and most of my life I believed a man's job was simple. Work hard, take care of your family, stay loyal. I thought if you did those things long enough, the people around you would eventually value you for it. I was wrong about that. I built Mercer Distribution from one rented truck and a storage garage outside Columbus, Ohio. 35 years later, it became one of the largest warehouse distribution companies in the region. Nothing about it came easy. There were winters when I slept in the warehouse office because I could not afford both a motel and fuel for deliveries. There were years I worked 7 days a week, while Carol stayed home raising Ava. I never complained. I was proud of what we built. My father used to tell me something when I was young. Quiet men hold everything together while louder people take the credit. Back then I thought he was talking about business. Turns out he was talking about life. I met Carol when I was 26. She was confident, social, beautiful. The kind of woman who made people look when she walked into a room. I was quieter, more comfortable around loading docks than fancy restaurants. But somehow we fit together. At least, I believed we did. We got married young, had Ava a few years later. I focused on growing the business while Carol handled the social side of our life. Charity events, dinners, company parties, vacations. And honestly, I liked it that way. I liked providing for them. I liked seeing my wife comfortable and my daughter safe. But over time, comfort changed people. Somewhere along the line, what I provided stopped feeling appreciated and started feeling expected. The first time I really felt it was about 8 months before my stroke. Ava had friends over for dinner. Ethan was there too, sitting at the table like he already owned part of the house. Ethan always had opinions about business, despite never keeping a steady job for very long. That night, Carol looked out the front window and laughed quietly. I still cannot believe Daniel drives that old pickup truck to executive meetings. Everybody chuckled. I smiled a little and kept eating. Then Ethan leaned back in his chair. That's because Daniel still thinks like a warehouse worker instead of an owner. More laughter. I looked over at Ava, expecting her to say something. She didn't. She just looked down at her wine glass with a small smile on her face. That hurt more than Ethan's comment, not because she laughed, because she stayed silent. After that night, little comments started happening more often. Carol compared us to other couples constantly. Melissa's husband bought her a condo in Miami. Richard upgraded to a Bentley. Do you ever wonder what life would have looked like if you took more risks? I always answered the same way. We already have enough. But eventually, I noticed something changing between Carol and Ethan, too. Late-night conversations that stopped when I walked into the kitchen. Lunch meetings I knew nothing about. Phone calls that suddenly ended when I entered the room. Then Ethan started spending more time at the company. At first, he said he wanted to learn operations. But slowly, employees started treating him differently, like management. One afternoon, I walked past a conference room and heard Ethan telling my logistics director, "Mercer Distribution needs modern leadership. Daniel still runs this place like he's afraid of success." The room went completely quiet when they saw me standing there. Ethan smiled immediately. "Just throwing ideas around," I nodded once and walked away. That's who I was back then. I avoided conflict. I convinced myself peace mattered more than pride. What I did not realize was that every time I ignored disrespect, they started believing I was too weak to confront it. 3 months later, Carol started asking strange questions during dinner. "What happens if you ever step away from the company suddenly? Who takes over final decisions? Have you updated the ownership paperwork recently?" I remember laughing softly. "Planning my funeral already?" Carol smiled back, but something about it felt cold. "You never know what life brings. I should have listened more carefully." The stroke happened on a Thursday morning during a quarterly board meeting. I remember pointing at shipping numbers on the screen when suddenly the room tilted sideways. The remote slipped from my hand. My mouth stopped working properly. Then everything crashed into darkness. The next few days were a blur of lights, medication, and voices I could barely follow. Sometimes I drifted awake for a few minutes. Sometimes entire hours disappeared. Carol controlled everything: visitors, phone calls, information. Whenever nurses asked me questions, she answered before I could even try. "He's confused. He's exhausted." The doctor said he shouldn't stress himself, even when I understood every word around me. Then Ethan started showing up constantly, walking the halls in expensive suits, taking business calls outside my room, talking to employees like he already owned the company. One afternoon I heard him say, "Daniel built something solid, but honestly, the company will move faster under new leadership." That phrase stayed with me all night. New leadership, not recovery, not helping me heal, replacing me. But the real turning point came 4 nights later. The hallway outside my room was quiet, except for distant footsteps and rolling carts. Carol thought I was asleep. I heard her talking softly with the doctor near the doorway. "If there's permanent cognitive damage," she asked carefully, "how quickly can hospice care be approved?" The doctor sounded uncomfortable. "Mrs. Mercer, it's too early to make those decisions." Carol nodded calmly, like they were discussing insurance forms. After the doctor walked away, Ethan stepped closer to her. I could hear ice moving inside his coffee cup. "Investors are ready," he whispered. "Once Daniel's officially out of the picture, we can move fast." Carol let out a slow breath. "Good," she said quietly. "I'm tired of waiting." My chest tightened. Not from fear, from clarity. They were not afraid of losing me. They were waiting for me to disappear. The next night, I heard even worse. Carol and Ethan sat outside my room laughing quietly together. Ethan said, "That penthouse condo downtown is still available if we move quickly." Carol laughed softly. "Daniel spent his whole life building this company just to die before enjoying any of it." Then they both laughed again. Not nervous laughter, not uncomfortable laughter. Happy laughter. Something inside me changed permanently in that moment. For 35 years, I had protected people who were already planning their future without me while I was still alive. That was the night the loyal husband died, and the man who finally stopped chasing their approval took his place. The next morning, I asked Carol for my phone while pretending to struggle more than I actually was. Her face softened immediately. "You just focus on resting," she said gently. "I'm handling everything." I nodded weakly. The second she walked out, I called my attorney, Martin Hale. Then I called Rebecca Sloan, our CFO. Rebecca had worked beside me for 19 years. Quiet woman, careful, loyal. I asked her one question. Has Ethan tried accessing executive transfer systems? There was a pause. Then she answered carefully, yes. That single word told me everything. Over the next 2 weeks, I stayed quiet. I let Carol believe the stroke damaged me more than it had. I let Ethan walk around the company pretending to be the future CEO. Meanwhile, Rebecca started documenting everything: unauthorized investor talks, forged approvals, illegal transfer attempts, emails, internal messages, board communications. Every move Ethan made triggered compliance alerts he did not even know existed. Years earlier, after my father died, I quietly placed Mercer Distribution inside a protected holding structure with restricted voting rights and automatic legal reviews during emergency leadership changes. Not because I distrusted my family back then, because my father warned me never to leave a business exposed to emotion. Ethan thought he was taking control. In reality, he was building a case against himself. Carol never knew either. She assumed everything belonged directly to me. She thought once I became weak enough, the company would naturally become hers too. During those hospital weeks, I mostly listened, and people say dangerous things when they think you no longer matter. Ava visited me one afternoon alone. She looked nervous, sitting beside my bed. Finally, she whispered, "Mom says the company might need new leadership soon." I looked at my daughter for a long moment. "Do you believe that too?" She hesitated. That hesitation hurt more than the stroke itself, because it told me greed had reached her too. When I was finally discharged, Ethan was already working out of my office several days a week. Employees looked uncomfortable around him. Rebecca kept her head down and waited, and I stayed patient. 2 weeks later, Ethan scheduled a private board meeting with investors to finalize what he believed would become a transition agreement. What he did not know was Rebecca had already handed every document to my attorney. The meeting started at 9 that morning. At 9:12, I walked into the boardroom myself. The room went silent instantly. Carol's face lost all color. Ethan stood up so fast his chair rolled backward. "Daniel," I walked slowly to the head of the table and sat down. No anger, no yelling, just calm. My attorney placed folders in front of the board members while Rebecca connected her laptop to the screen. Ethan tried speaking first. "Daniel, you should still be recovering." I looked directly at him. "You should have been more careful." Nobody spoke after that. Rebecca began presenting the evidence: forged approvals, unauthorized transfers, investor negotiations during my medical incapacity. Then came the recordings. Carol discussing hospice paperwork. Ethan talking about selling the company before I recovered. Their conversations about condos, money, and finally living properly once I was gone. Nobody in that room could even look at them afterward. Then my attorney explained the real situation. Mercer Distribution was never directly transferable. Ownership protections created years earlier automatically froze suspicious executive activity during medical emergencies. Every illegal move Ethan made had been tracked from the beginning. The investigation file was nearly 3 inches thick. Ethan looked sick. Carol stared at me like she was looking at a stranger. Finally, she whispered, "You planned this?" I shook my head slowly. "No, you did." Then I slid divorce papers across the table toward her. For the first time in years, nobody interrupted me while I spoke. I looked around the room, quietly. "The only reason any of you had comfort, security, or status is because I spent 35 years protecting this company from bad decisions. Then I looked directly at Ethan. And sometimes that protection included family. Security escorted Ethan out before the meeting was even finished. Carol sat frozen in her chair while my attorney explained she no longer had any authority connected to the company or its ownership structures. The future she imagined disappeared in less than an hour. Ava cried afterward, real tears, not over money, over finally realizing what she became part of. A week later, she came to see me alone. "Dad," she said quietly, "I didn't realize how bad it had gotten." I believed her. That was the difference between her and the others. She still felt shame. Months passed. Ethan became the center of fraud investigations and lawsuits. Investors cut ties with him almost immediately once the evidence became public inside the industry. Carol called me many times, at first angry, then emotional, then apologetic. One voicemail stayed with me. "I never thought you'd shut me out completely." I sat there for a long time after hearing that, because shutting me out was exactly what they had been doing to me for years. Only now, they finally understood how it felt. The divorce finalized quietly. No screaming, no courtroom drama, just signatures and consequences. I restructured future company ownership, so accountability and contribution mattered more than blood. For once, loyalty would actually mean something. About 8 months later, I walked slowly through the warehouse floor for the first time since the stroke. Forklifts moved between loading lanes, while workers nodded at me respectfully. Some of those men had worked beside me for over 20 years. They knew exactly who built that place. Rebecca met me near the shipping docks, holding final transition paperwork. "You sure about stepping back?" she asked. I smiled a little. For the first time in my life, yeah. I signed the papers, handed permanent authority to leadership I trusted, and walked outside into the cold evening air. My old pickup truck was still sitting in the same parking space everyone used to mock me for driving. I stood there for a second looking at it. Then I smiled, because that truck was paid for, just like my peace finally was. I climbed inside and drove north toward the lake house I bought after the divorce. No penthouse condo, no luxury tower, just quiet water, trees, and silence. That evening I sat alone on the porch, watching the sun disappear across the lake. No phones ringing, no people wanting something from me, no voices trying to turn my life into their opportunity. Just peace. The people who thought my silence meant weakness never understood that my silence was the thing holding their entire world together. And once I stopped protecting them, everything they built their identity on collapsed right beside me.